kick us off now. So hello everyone and welcome to our webinar this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're coming from. My name is Victoria Herman and I'm the Managing Director of the Arctic Institute, and I am one of the principal investigators for the Arctic Migrations in Harmony Research Coordination Network. And that network is hosting this webinar. It is our 12th webinar in our series this year, with a few more in the remainder of the year. The Migration in Harmony Research Coordination Network is a National Science Foundation network that brings together all sorts of practitioners, scholars, researchers, traditional and indigenous knowledge holders, and students to discuss different dimensions of Arctic migrations, to synthesize current work being done on those migrations and mobilities, and to prioritize what we can do in collaborative research teams across disciplines and knowledges to fill research gaps. And if you have not already done so, I highly encourage you to join our free network. We are 550 plus network members strong. And hopefully in the year to come, we will be meeting in Alaska and then in Sweden. So we can continue our virtual programming and add some in-person programming too. Today, I have the incredible honor of hosting and introducing a pioneering scientist and one of my good friends, Dr. Kimberly R. Miner. And Dr. Miner will share today her research on permafrost degradation and the intersection of that degradation with our human systems. Dr. Miner is a scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab in California, and also an assistant research professor at the Climate Change Research Institute at the University of Maine. At the Jet Propulsion Lab, she works on the Arctic Methane Project, looking at the impacts of climate change in the Arctic. And generally, she researches climate change with multinational teams in Canada, Switzerland, Italy, and Alaska. During her PhD, she developed the first health assessment of glacial meltwater pollution. And that groundbreaking work got fellowships and awards from Fulbright, from the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense. And we are just so excited to hear Dr. Miner's presentation today. A few housekeeping rules. I am going to hand it over to Dr. Miner now, but I will be monitoring the chat throughout her presentation. If you have questions throughout her presentation for Dr. Miner, please put them in the chat so that I can start to collect them for the question and answer session, where we'll open it up for a discussion. I can either read your questions, or you can come on video or audio and ask the question yourself. For those of you who have to leave early, not to worry, we are recording this and we'll post it on YouTube later today, so you can catch whatever you miss then. I think that is all from me, so I will hand it over to you, Dr. Miner.
Thank you, Dr. Herman. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming, and it's nice to see some familiar faces. We were just testing this earlier, and there is a little bit of user challenges on my side. So I'm going to attempt now to share my screen and my PowerPoint. Hopefully it will go as planned. Let's see. All right. I saw a thumbs up from Sam. Yeah, you guys can see a PowerPoint? Great. All right. So step one complete. Oh, go back. Okay. All right, great. So one little more housekeeping thing. I do have a dog. The dog is supposed to be downstairs and may come upstairs. So that will be addressed as need be if she comes in and starts barking. So thank you for having me today. I'm going to be discussing some of the research that we are just really starting. This is a very high level talk, and I'm more than happy to get into more details with people. As that arises, I'd love to have a larger question and answer period. So please feel free to just jump in the chat and put any questions as they come to you, and we'll address them later. As Dr. Herman mentioned, I am at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, part of a brand new project looking at the different dynamics that are going on in the Arctic, including the release of methane and the attempts to constrain that release, both geologically as far as geospatially, and also what kind and how much of carbon is being released. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. This is a little bit of a pet project that I'm working on, looking at all the different things, all the weird stuff coming out of the permafrost and the glaciers and how they're moving throughout the system. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So everyone is very familiar that the Arctic is changing. This year, we have lost a good section of some floating or iceberg style glaciers off of Greenland. There's also been reports since 2015, as you can see, but even more recently, of these holes, if you will, in the Russian permafrost where methane potentially has been released and there's some kind of seepage going on. There's also these things that we call thermokarst, which is when the permafrost thaws and there's subsidence or old permafrost is showing up. And we're going to get a little bit more into detail with this, but basically what it means functionally is that there are lakes that are forming on what used to be dry frozen tundra. And that obviously has a lot of problems and indications for what could be next for the Arctic, whether it would be wet or dry, and how that's going to impact the amount of methane and other things that come out of the permafrost. But one of the things that is kind of the side note, maybe the quiet whispering underneath this whole conversation, is that there's other stuff in the permafrost too. Within the microbiome of the permafrost, there are bacteria that are incredibly diverse. There are viruses, some that have co-evolved from, up to millions of years ago. And there are a number of different things that we don't necessarily know about yet, and we're still going to have to be constraining over the next few years as they begin to melt out. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and we're going to be talking again at a very high level, elucidating some of the things that we're looking for, and then I'm happy to go through and bore you with the genus and species and that kind of thing if someone's very interested. All right, so let's talk about permafrost. So permafrost is in essence frozen soil. We're going to get a little bit into it, but it's about 80 to 90% ice. There is permafrost that is in place right now that's been there since the early Cenozoic at least. So there are some places where permafrost is millions of years old. A lot of it's thousands of years old, hundreds of thousands of years old, so quite old. It contains a lot of organic carbon. So things have died, got buried, got frozen. So when we're saying carbon, that's just detritus, basically, plants and animals that are dead and have created this beautiful soil that's then frozen. And the rapid thaw in the last 50 years, what I was calling thermokarst earlier, has caused the structural dynamics, the way that the land is laid out, the lakes that are forming to really change the look of the tundra. As you can see in the bottom right picture here, that series of lakes is really big transformation from the flat, almost, tundra that used to be less vegetative. And then the thaw dynamics are obviously based on the underlying structure. So the geomorphology of the tundra, what was there before, is important. This is an image from Colombia talking about the last glacial maximum. So there is indication that this kind of thawing event has happened in the past, although what we're looking at is the rate, okay? The rate of this thawing event, this very short time period with significant thaw, has not really happened as far as we're concerned in the past. So as you can see in the last glacial maximum, there's a transition from more continuous permafrost with a lot of ice wedges to, in the deglaciation image, what you're really seeing now, a lot more lakes, a lot more rivers, a lot more channels. So this is a lovely image from Shore et al. In 2018. And it's just really detailing some of the dynamics that can lead to abrupt thaw. The lakes and ponds we've talked about at length, but also wildfires. You know, we've talked a lot about wildfires in the news, and there are wildfires going on in Alaska. There's even wildfires that may be happening year round, right underneath the surface layer of the soil, which is another really interesting dynamic. But the more that we have water penetration, as you can see on the far left of this image, you're going to see deeper thaw, and thaw that's in weird and interesting dynamics, like those holes that you see in Russia, where you've got water penetration and thawing in different and intricate ways, not necessarily going all the way down in a lateral way. So I wanted to start by talking about eudoma. So eudoma is the oldest and deepest permafrost. This is the really, really old stuff. It is 2% carbon by mass, which is a lot, but it's also 80 to 90% ice, which means that if it's exposed in a thermokarst situation where water comes down and, you know, there's more movement for it to be exposed to the air, or if there's a seismic event, that it can melt really rapidly, and it can contribute up to 50% an increase above where we are right now and release carbon. So basically what that means functionally for us is if the eudoma shows up exposed to the air, we're going to have more methane and CO2 release, which is bad, okay? Because that's what's driving the climate change warming. But one of the things that we're very interested in right now is that there may have been microbes and viruses that co-evolved with organisms in ancient times, in Cenozoic times, in the times of the mammoth, all the way up through the beginning of what we call modern human history, that may still be viable. Okay, so there are certain properties that protect bacteria, and some viruses for bacteria, a lipid membrane, for example, being a generalist, able to survive in lots of different circumstances, make them able to just kind of sit around for thousands and millions of years. A paper I read yesterday resurrected a bacteria from 100 million years ago. So there is some opportunity for things that co-evolved with species that no longer exist to come back and hang out with us. This is a methanogenic microbe, so this is a little bit different, but this is something that eats carbon and puts out methane. I'm not sure if you guys saw the video I did for the kids a couple of weeks ago. I talked a lot about farting, and these are the microbes that I was talking about that eat the carbon and release the methane. So when we're talking about and looking for these generalist microbes, what we're looking for, as I mentioned, is a microbe with a lipid membrane that makes it still viable. It's also potentially able to thrive or survive at very low temperatures. So when I'm saying very low, I'm thinking negative 15 C. That's what we're talking about. It's also possible that there's able to survive at lower temperatures, but there's inherent stability within the permafrost, whether it is within the structure of the soil or whether it's within the water veins and crystalline structure of the ice. So there is some stability that allows them to be protected. And again, happy to get more into that if someone would like to talk about it. So we know of viruses and bacteria as diverse as anthrax and the plague. Okay, so Black Death, smallpox, people were they were very sick and they were buried. Entire villages were buried in the permafrost, as we took for granted that the permafrost would stay frozen. And then recently, some of those graves have either been exposed or resurrected. In some cases, scientists have gone and taken samples to determine whether or not the smallpox is still viable and whether they can make it viable again, which is, maybe something that's a little bit debatable as to whether or not that's the greatest idea. But what we're really interested in is the unknown bacteria, viruses, and microbes, the things that did co-evolve with something else, the bacteria that worked with mammoth to keep them warm or safe, or they lived inside of their gut, some kind of interaction, a symbiotic relationship with a species that no longer exists. That's what I'm very interested in seeing if we can find. And then other potentially eradicated diseases that are somehow within the permafrost, whether it's from graves or it's from other mechanisms, just wanting to be really aware as we go through and make sure that that is something that we're aware of before they're resurrected. One thing I did start thinking about yesterday is that there have been a number of different locations where one specific type of anthrax came out of the permafrost, even though they were geographically disparate, which basically means that at some point, a bunch of anthrax of one specific type, one specific species, was frozen in the permafrost. And it was very prevalent back then, so a lot of it got frozen. But what it means for us is that we may have anthrax, as an example, coming out of different locations at the same time, making it incredibly difficult to trace the source, when in actuality, the source might be disparate. So a little bit of Halloween fun for you guys. So while we're talking about anthrax, how do microbes spread? So this is from the CDC. Please excuse that it is a little blurry, but for anthrax, you can see that they live in the environment, right? And so they can stay in the environment at a variety of temperatures, almost in stasis, if you will. And then they are activated when they are taken into the body or somehow the outside or the inside of an animal. So that can be reindeer, 200 reindeer, and this latest anthrax outbreak in Siberia were killed. It can be cattle, as you see in the image, and then it can be transferred then from warm body to warm body. So this can be as simple as something melting out, thawing out of the permafrost, being uptaken by a grazer, whether it's in, Russia or Canada, uptaken by a grazer and then transferred to the human population. All right, I'm realizing how scary this is. Is everybody still doing okay here? A lot of gross anthrax stuff going on. So as I mentioned, there's 200 reindeer and a child that were recently killed in Siberia, and there's some implication that it may have been a transfer from permafrost, anthrax from permafrost to the local population through this reindeer. One of the other things that I did mention that is a point of concern is that we are also excavating not only graves like of the smallpox victim, but also old microbes from, for example, caribou feces. Now, in the microbe caribou feces study, it was very interesting. They were able to clone the novel bacteria that they found into a modern plant. However, there is concern for biocontamination in not only the lab in which they did it, but all the transport routes. And right now we don't have any kind of monitoring or regulation because it's all, all constrained on the Earth. There's inner planet biohazard monitoring, but we don't really have that coming from the Arctic. So that is a concern in potentially unprotected labs. Also, as we expand tourism, whether it's folks walking around on the tundra, taking cruise ships, drilling for oil, there is also the potential for contact between people and the environment in that way, in which viruses and bacteria, other microbes could be transferred and then expanded. And in the time of COVID, when we're all really thinking about transference, this is something that, is worth talking about right now. Well, it's of interest to a number of people. Okay, so on that light note, we are going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the other things that are coming out of the permafrost. In order to do that, I'm going to give you guys a very light atmospheric physics lesson. So this is a big part of what we did, or what I did for my PhD. There's a very interesting dynamic that if you think about, the Earth is a closed system, right? So whatever you release on the Earth can travel all over the Earth. If I release something into the atmosphere here, it will go somewhere else. That's pretty well known. But there's an interesting dynamic at both poles, we'll talk about the Arctic today, that the cold temperatures and the crystalline structure of the snow allows for these things that have been released into the atmosphere to kind of collect. So the snow can scavenge, can take out these, let's just say pollutants for ease, and bring them down to the glacier surface, where then, in a time where glaciers are growing, not right now, but in old times, 30 years ago, as the glaciers would grow year to year, these chemicals would get trapped within the glaciers. And like I said all the time when I was giving this talk during my PhD, it was perfect. It was almost like a garbage heap far away that no one could get to. And then the glaciers started melting. So these chemicals started being released back into the watershed. And I looked at DDT specifically in the way that it interacted with the downstream people and plants within the whole watershed once it was being released from glaciers. Okay, so this is a dynamic that's pretty well known. It's happening in many, many cold systems and specifically in the Arctic. So we talked about, I just mentioned DDT, hexachlorohexene, which is also a pesticide that was used in the bread baskets in China, India, in Canada, and in like the Kansas region, a little bit less, but in the American breadbasket, are also species of concern that have been found in snow systems all across the world, and specifically in the Arctic. PCBs and other industrial chemicals that were used to really ease and help industrial processes and are a big part of why we have done so well as a society, have these unfortunate side effects. And they also are very volatile. They're able to move through the system easily, and they stay around for a really long time. These days, we still use things like brominated flame retardants when you get a new bed, that kind of weird smell when you unpack it. Those are the brominated flame retardants, the PFAS, plasticizers, all of these nasties can kind of, they can get together, they can kind of aggregate in the poles and then get brought to the surface more easily, where they can then obviously move through the watershed and through the organisms there. So the direct retransmission would be through sublimation of the chemicals, so transferring from a solid state to a vapor state. Also melting, moving throughout the watershed. And you can see on the left, there was this recent oil spill in Russia. So this is another direct transport route. And then heavy metals. There was a really great study that just came out of our group about heavy metals from mine tailings and atmospheric deposition, mercury, that has been transported and then deposited and is now moving throughout the melting Arctic system and the thawing permafrost, transported either in liquid water or, you know, through other processes as the systems move and flush out. These are also two pictures from Russia. So we also have direct transport, so stuff we have put in the Arctic. There can be released during industrial use, like I showed with the oil spill. We've also got, and by we, I mean all the people. So the Russians, the Americans, the Danes, a lot of northern countries have either mined or utilized or stored nuclear materials in the Arctic. This can be either at military bases where materials were used and then have been left in barrels, buried. It can be nuclear testing sites that have been utilized within the permafrost. And the, you know, again, the premise that the permafrost would not melt and so, or would not thaw, and so there would be no challenge there. But then also released from accidents, global transport, shipwrecks. We've had a number of shipwrecks recently. As you can see, obviously there have been shipwrecks for a couple generations. And then we think about something like the HMS Terror and that, you know, very intense and dramatic shipwreck. More recent shipwrecks have transported more chemicals, more fossil fuels, more plastics into the Arctic than something like the HMS Terror would be able to. So their sunken canned goods are nothing compared to what it means to have a shipwreck these days. So when I'm talking about things moving through the system, I just wanted to give a little bit of an indication of what I mean here to make sure that it's totally clear. So the permafrost thaw allows, as I mentioned, water to be transported through the system through different rivers and lakes and out to either the ocean, to human settlements, or to other parts of the permafrost where it can be moved and then stored. There is also the evaporation component and the entrainment that is inherent within the cold regions may not be as useful if the cold regions begin to warm up. Meaning, if we put things into the atmosphere and we're used to them all getting stuck in the Arctic away from us, it's possible that they may not get stuck in the Arctic as much as the Arctic starts to warm up and the air currents begin to change. Then you also see on the very far left, as the tundra changes and we have more of these lakes and ponds forming, There are more direct routes of atmospheric absorption. So things like releasing CO2 and CH4 into the atmosphere, methane into the atmosphere, can be even more direct just from the surface of the land. So I'm actually getting kind of close to the end of the presentation. I got pretty excited. I get a little excited about the bad things, which is kind of an interesting and unique personality trait. So I'm really hoping you guys are thinking about a lot of questions and that we can have a nice and robust conversation as well. So some of the secondary impacts of these changes. There is discussion happening among many communities about whether these hazards can be transported globally. So because we have a little bit of time, we'll talk about them more specifically. So if you look at the chemicals, for example, that are moving back into the atmospheric circulation, there is a possibility that they could be recirculated as patterns change or as precipitation patterns change. The old viruses and bacteria could potentially move through the subsurface soil, down through rivers and out into the ocean to change things there. Now, we just put an article in to Science, and we'll see if it gets accepted, but one of the things we were discussing is that there are terrestrial microbes that have the ability to uptake a ton of carbon, and that's something we know about them, and that's really neat for them. But recently, they have identified the genome of this terrestrial microbe in a marine microbe, meaning that these terrestrial microbes have gone down through the rivers, gone into the ocean, and have somehow given their genomes to another microbe that have now changed and mutated to absorb more carbon. Okay, so that's an immediate and direct impact of this thaw, is that things that used to be only on the land are now finding their way to the ocean and changing the microbiome of the ocean very quickly. This is very, very quickly, guys, over, less than 5 years. So this is a really big transference that could happen on many different levels. And, as any soil scientist would tell you, when you change the structure, the underlying structure of the microbiome, you're going to have reverberations all the way up through the plant and vegetative material. Obviously, viruses, we're pretty all familiar with viruses at this point. Germ theory is something we're all really good at now. But there are implications for other organisms for virus transport as well. There are viruses that target bacteria. There are viruses that target vegetation. So there's a bunch of different changes that the release of these biotics into the Earth system could potentially trigger. Whether or not they're able to be released and whether or not they're able to be released on a widespread scale, that's something that we all are really still needing to look into. The greening of the Arctic is also something that's emergent in the literature within the last couple of years. Basically, what we've been talking about with water moving, when there's water and there is soil, things grow. So things are growing. And what that means is that the entire biome is starting to really change and to look different, and different organisms can live there. So we've got both this top-down change and this bottom-up change going on that really makes the full system pretty different and pretty dynamic in a way that it's never been fully static, but it's moving into a more dynamic transition towards a warmer, more vegetative state, which is an interesting thing to follow and not necessarily the greatest thing for humans who like a more stable ecosystem. The direct human impacts obviously will impact the local populations first. My research on glacial pollution showed that the uptake of DDT through salmon by local populations could be significant. This obviously will continue to grow as more microbes, more waste and refuse is released into the environment. So probably not a real great thing. Food availability is changing landscapes. And species loss happens will also shift, especially if you are reliant on any kind of natural matter such as fish or game. But then also if you think about any kind of contamination that happens, that will also shift the dynamics of species mobility and the ability for them to live in their environment. Bioaccumulation is always a concern, meaning if I eat something and I'm a lot fattier than the berry that I ate, I might be able to uptake and keep more chemicals within me. So that's a concern already for mercury, and not like I mentioned for DDT. But then again, as more things mobilize, is it more of a concern? And is it a concern for any children that are, get this passed on from them? So the general trend of what we're seeing across all of these different media is that the Arctic, we're used to the Arctic being a sink. The snow comes down, it brings a bunch of icky pollution with it, and it's stuck there. And we're good with that. There's a lot of snow, there's a lot of ice. We don't think very much about the Arctic. It's stable. And it's possible that it's going to become more of a sink, or more of a source now, excuse me. Not only are we releasing more methane and carbon dioxide, also all of these other organisms and all of these other chemicals that we've discussed could be emitted more than they are being uptaken. As I mentioned a couple times, COVID-19 is kind of creating a backdrop for more intensive study for what these viruses could be and where they could be emergent from. We're pretty familiar as a scientific group that there is opportunity for forests, for the Amazon to provide novel and interesting bacteria and viruses. But I postulate that that same level of interest and availability exists within the permafrost, if not greater. But it's important to remember that microbes can also bring breakthroughs. There are microbes that were found in the Arctic that are responsible for a lot of the success of refrigeration. Some species of plants that have been genetically engineered with these microbes are able to stay colder longer. So I can get some oranges from Florida and some tomatoes from California and have a good life. So there are general breakthroughs that we can probably expect with some of these microbes. I also read a study yesterday that new bacteria were found at a contaminated permafrost site that's able to uptake fossil fuels and digest them at a 60% rate, which is extraordinary and has great implications for bioremediation. But I think the overarching question of all of this work, and my overarching question, at least for the next couple of years, is what happens when these old organisms, things that co-evolved with mammoths, things that lived with early humans, what happens when they interact with us, with modern ecology, with the modern songbirds, with all the different things that now live in the Arctic and are coming from the Arctic, that are going through the Arctic, that just live in the Arctic for a season. What happens when they live together with us, and how does that change us, and how does that change them? And it's probably a question that we're going to be able to answer in hindsight, but I would really love to get a little bit more ahead of it than we are right now. So as I mentioned, I'm part of this Arctic methane project with NASA and the European Space Agency. We are always happy to chat with folks about collaboration. Be more than happy to talk with anyone who's into remote sensing, who's into Arctic work. Well, I am also hopefully planning on going up to Alaska in the summer to do some drilling in some of the permafrost tunnels and see what we can, if we can start identifying some creepy crawlies. So I'd love to hear from anyone who's interested in talking about that. Folks who are in Alaska, always thrilled to include anyone living in Arctic nations. Generally an Arctic research collaboration, like Dr. Herman is creating and has created, but a little bit more focused on these specific permafrost dynamics, is something that we're working on. To do that, we've combined both satellite. My immediate supervisor is with the above program, so the Arctic Boreal visioning program, and also in situ monitoring, which is what I like, getting down and dirty and taking little sections of the permafrost and testing them in a lab. But I think that the big take home, and I'm sure this has come across with all of the scary things that I've talked about, is that the really important thing to do is to do everything we can to try to mitigate the thaw, to try to stop the permafrost from thawing. If the permafrost doesn't thaw, then we don't have to talk about any of these guys. We don't have to talk about any of these weird bacteria, microbes, viruses, creepy crawlies, nuclear waste, oil that could be emergent from the permafrost. We would be able to go talk about more interesting things. I could be a kindergarten teacher, something like that. So that's always the priority, is to work very hard to slow this changing warming, this changing climate dynamic. So with that, I'll leave you with a interesting, beautiful, and creepy picture from Victor Leshik at University of Arizona. And like I mentioned, I hope that we're able to have a robust discussion. Thanks for your attention, everyone.
Thank you so much. If everyone could join me in giving a virtual round of applause for Dr. Miner. We have lots of time for questions and answers, which is great because we already have lots of questions for you. As a reminder, you can type your question into the chat box and I can either read it out loud if you have limited bandwidth or in a loud house, or you can come on video or audio. So we are going to kick off our question and answer with a question from Samantha Wins. And she wants to know what the purpose of cloning the caribou microbe in modern plants was. Was that GMO research?
Hey, Sam, thanks for your question. I don't think you're going to like the answer very much. My understanding was that it was to show that you could do it. So the question of whether or not the microbes are viable is a very interesting and very important question. But the next step of that is to do something with them. So my understanding of this work, which is so impressive, it's so impressive. And if we leave the moral questions and the concerns about biohazards aside, it's very, very cool research. But my understanding was that they were just doing it to see if it was possible to reinvigorate these very old microbes within modern media. And yes, it is. Spoiler alert.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Fred to either come on video or unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. I have a question about the lakes. Typically, I assume they're pretty shallow, but are they seasonal? Have they dissolved salts from the permafrost, or are they essentially fresh water? Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. That's a really good question. And I think it would really be based on the geomorphology of the area. So depending on what the permafrost is made out of in that area, I assume that they would be, like you said, mostly freshwater, because we're talking about mostly ice. They wouldn't be seasonal in the way that they would disappear based on the seasons necessarily. Some of them obviously freeze in the winter, but then if there's any kind of additional movement in the permafrost below, you could lose that water simply because it's moving from one place to another, right? So if it's moving from a lower elevation, it may look as though it's been lost, but it's just being transported somewhere else. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's seasonal per se, but it is definitely very dynamic and very fluid, for lack of a better term.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask Tara to unmute themselves or come on video and ask your question.
Hi, thanks. I was just wondering if you had done any research or looked at any implications of historical petroleum-based releases and how that could impact the integrity of the permafrost, just due to the saturations and the lower freezing points of petroleum-based, specifically diesel and such, and how that may play a role?
Hey, Tara. Yeah, that's an amazing question. I have not looked at that, and that hasn't been something that I've considered. And now that you mention it, I'm absolutely going to look into it, because it does seem to me as well that if you've got some kind of deposition, probably good deposition, not a thin layer, but a heavy layer of petroleum product that is in the permafrost somewhere, that you would definitely have different thermal dynamics and potentially different mobility of any kind of water or hydrology around it. So excellent question. And I would be more than happy to follow up with you if you want to give Dr. Herman your email address.
Great. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Susan to come on and ask your question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Herman, and thank you, Dr. Miner, for doing all this great work. I'm glad we have some talented women up there taking care of business. My question is the marine microbe that you mentioned that has been changing with the, well, it changed from the DNA of the soil-based microbe. Does that emit, does that emit methane in the sea?
Yeah, it would either emit methane or CO2. Basically, methane is like CO2, but without the oxygen, right? So depending on what kind of environment that organism is in, it would release some kind of carbon gas. So yeah, and there's also a bunch of different seeps and sources of methane within the marine area around the Arctic that's kind of emergent because of the thawing of permafrost, even in near ocean environments. So it's a concern, probably more for that than for these, bacteria changing their status.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to skip a bit and ask Katya to come on because she also had a question about subsea permafrost. So we're skipping in line a bit, but Katya, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for such an amazing presentation. And I've got a quick question. Could you please briefly describe the current situation with the subsea permafrost, what we know about this, what kind of the studies are on the go, and where can we get some more information about this? Because all the scientists, they're focused on terrestrial one. But what about the ocean? Ocean is big. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is not my specialty, but there are a lot of people looking at this. Subsea permafrost is definitely existent, and it's definitely a problem as the Arctic Ocean is warming. You're seeing very similar dynamics. Also changes in saltiness. The stratification of the ocean, where some parts are more salty, some parts are less salty because of melting sea surface ice. That's all going to really change those dynamics. So I guess the more I'm looking at these questions, I'm thinking I might just give you guys my UMaine email address, and I'm happy to send some of these studies out. Yerith also asked for the specific studies that I referenced about some of the old microbes and the microbes that uptake fossil fuels, the bacteria. I'm more than happy to send these to you. I do have 2 other jobs, so please keep that in mind. But I'd love to send you guys citations so that we can continue to have these very good discussions. So I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat as we're towards the end here.
And we will make sure to include those citations and also Dr. Miner's University of Maine email in the follow-up email to everyone registered for this, which will include the recorded version of this from another question we got, and that will be available later today. So I'm going to ask a question from Susan. Would it not be best to give the Arctic a protected status similar to the Antarctic Treaty from exploitation, to be permitted only for resident populations and ideally under a stewardship of Indigenous peoples who not only have older rights than anyone else, but also experience and have all consequences directly and immediately in their areas? So I guess shorter version, would it not be best to have a protected status or governance through a treaty like the Antarctic Treaty?
Sure, yeah. Unfortunately, the Arctic, is a bunch of different nations. So it's not going to be very easy to do that. And also there's a bunch of resources inherent within the Arctic. Russia represents a huge portion of the Arctic. So that's a lot of land that they would have to give up. One of the things that we are discussing as a team, though, is something like the planetary protection guidelines, where we make sure and clean off all of our gear very, very well, so that it doesn't biocontaminate other worlds. And that when we bring things back from Mars, we clean it off very, very well so that it doesn't biocontaminate Earth. So something like that, some guidance around tracking things to and from the Arctic, I think might be a little bit of an easier sell, although, you know, protecting areas of land is, in my personal opinion, a good idea.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a question from Micah. How might these patterns influence food web dynamics at local and landscape scales?
Sure. So I think that that's still very much an emergent point of conversation. One of the things to think about, though, is that oftentimes when you see a food web having challenges or having reverberations throughout the food web that is challenging the food web, it's often because there's either movement up through the food web, something at the bottom of the food web changed, or movement down through the food web, right? Something at the top of the food web changed. But what I'm describing here is movement from the top and from the bottom. So with the landscape changing, potential vegetation changes, potential migration changes, atmospheric changes, precipitation changes, it's very possible that we are going to see lots of challenges, if you will, within the Arctic food web, although it might be difficult to know exactly what these are as of yet. So that's probably where I will leave that question, but again, happy to continue having conversations.
There are a lot of forthcoming conversations out of this starting webinar. I'm going to invite Roger to unmute themselves or come on video and ask your question.
So I know we're focused primarily on the microbiome here and on the biological components. Is there contemporaneous or collaborative work being done from a geological and an engineering perspective to look at infrastructure and securing existing or future infrastructure to protect Arctic livelihoods, to protect national security interests, and to prevent additional environmental degradation?
Yes, absolutely. So Dr. Herman is really on the forefront of this with her work. The Center for Climate and Security has been discussing this a lot. And then within the Arctic, there's a number of different groups, whether it's led by state and federal government, whether it's led by indigenous groups. There's a lot of discussion, the Arctic Council, about how to really secure and protect against infrastructure damage and failure. And the permafrost is part of that. Obviously, if you're losing the stability of the permafrost, anything that's on top of the permafrost may, collapse or subside. So that is definitely a conversation that is being had on a number of different levels. I think because I'm interested in the kind of subtle, weird things that people are not necessarily talking about, that's not something that I'm focusing on right now, but I'm very glad to say that a lot of people are doing excellent work on that front.
And we will be having a engineer-led webinar in early 2021 with one of our key collaborators of this research coordination network, Ming Zhao, who is at Penn State, and he leads another network specifically on permafrost coastal erosion, and he is a civil engineer. So stay tuned and make sure to sign up for that more engineering focus webinar to hear about his work. I am going to ask Leslie to come on and unmute themselves or come on video and ask your question.
Okay, is it working? I can't see. Okay, well, so I'm a visual artist up in Yukon in northern Canada, just beside Alaska there. And I have a permafrost project that I'm working on, and I'm sort of looking for collaboration with people that are working in this area, because I feel like it's really important to communicate the science to normal people on a level, on an emotional level, because right now it feels like we're not, in some areas, we're not getting that message across. And so I feel like this kind of project can help to get support for your projects in the long run as we change the minds of the general public. I mean, people are obviously coming around, but with all the fires and as that becomes a reality. But yeah, I think there's more work to do there. So my question is, are there people out there that are interested in collaborating? I provided a link, but I guess the chat doesn't get saved, but maybe people could have that link and they could look at the project and see, and it's just developing. And so I'm open to, you know, working with, you know, others and their ideas. And yeah, so it's a project in progress. It's not a completed project. So yeah, I feel like we need to give the North a voice, and I really appreciate that this webinar is doing that as well. So yeah.
Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm really looking forward to looking at that.
Great, thank you.
And those of you who are interested, the Arctic Institute is currently running a series about permafrost for many disciplines. And the most recent publication is from a group of researchers and artists who work on permafrost cartoons, which has been running for quite a few years. And there are some great cartoons on the arcticinstitute.org if you want to check out that artistic approach to sharing some of the science that is going on across the North. I'm going to ask Tim to come on and ask your question. But if he is having some issues coming on, I can ask a question in the meantime. So Andreas has heard that some...
Needed to unmute. Sorry. Okay, I'm now unmuted. Wondering, although not your current area of expertise, I'm wondering if the microbes of the past might be so different from our modern immune systems, particularly with that global transport model that you described, that they might precipitate a pandemic on the scale of the European introduction of smallpox to the indigenous populations of the Americas. And if you don't have an answer, I think this might be an area of research for yourself or some of the other participants.
Thanks, Tim. It is awesome to see you. Thank you for coming.
Awesome to see you.
So this is a good answer to Yareth's question as well about whether it makes me depressed. This is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. That what I mentioned yesterday, or what I mentioned that I came up with yesterday about all the different sites that are the same type of anthrax could be emergent from, and it'd be difficult to trace. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe.
More research.
Yeah, it's definitely
more research.
Definitely worth learning to meditate about. So it's not fun to think about, and it does make me depressed. And I also think it's really important. So that's why I keep doing it. Although I'd love to be a kindergarten teacher. So let's solve this thing so I can go and teach kindergarten.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I very much feel that way of my long lost passion for art history and being in museums, but alas, climate change is what keeps us up at night. We have another question about how someone has heard about Black Death cases reported frequently in Mongolia, and if this could have any connection to your presentation.
I don't know. I think it's possible. I think that it's possible that the anthrax outbreak was from the permafrost. I think that that's as possible as any other source to me. It's very difficult to directly trace these things when we don't know what's in the permafrost, which I think is why our first step is trying to characterize and categorize what we're finding in the permafrost, because then we're going to be able to trace it back and say, okay, we know what species attacked over here. Does that have a similar marker, similar genome? So I guess it's as likely for me right now, based on what I know, it's as likely as any other source, but I think an epidemiologist would be able to do a little bit better job answering that question.
Thank you. We have another question from AJ who asks, is it possible that this microbiome exchange has been occurring throughout time, but only now do we have the capabilities to monitor this? And I think this was in reference to the terrestrial versus ocean exchange.
Oh, okay. Potentially, but we haven't seen this rate of thaw of permafrost before. So I don't know. Sometimes I think about it like if you're thawing out your freezer, like, yeah, you have taken things out of your freezer before. Every time you open it, some like, you know, air comes out. But when you thaw the freezer, huge amounts of water pour out of your freezer, which is why it's really not great when the thing breaks. So yeah, it's possible, but it's, you know, not as likely as it could be now. How about that?
Great, thank you. We have another question from Yareth who asks if you can address rock permafrost or mountain permafrost and how it is identified and monitored. He thinks it seems difficult.
Sure. So permafrost is soil that's been frozen for 2 years or more. So if you have stuff on a mountain, soil on a mountain that's been frozen for 2 years or more, we can call it permafrost. If you have it in the rocks and it's been frozen for 2 years or more, it's usually soil. So like ice in between rocks that is exposed, I think you'd have a hard time calling that permafrost. But yeah, so that's basically the definition of permafrost. And it like I said, it is totally constrained by geomorphology. So the type of permafrost and the depth, the quality of it that you're seeing, for example, in Russia is going to be different than what you're seeing in northern Canada. It's not going to be night and day different, but it will be somewhat different.
Great, thank you. And as a reminder, we have time for more questions. So if you have some, please put them in the chat so I know to call on you. We have a question from Joseph, who I'm not sure if you want to come on video or not and ask your question, but I could ask it for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to ask it on video. So I'm a climate entrepreneur. We deploy mycelium networks in conjunction with plants, particularly trees, to combat climate change. So a couple people are saying they're depressed, but there is a lot of good stuff going on to combat this as well. And thanks for putting on the seminar. I have a friend who's writing a post-apocalyptic climate novel for young adults, and she's always asked me, like, how bad can it possibly be? And I'm always telling her, you have no idea how bad it could be. But I'll share the webinar with her. And my question, are there prions in the permafrost as well? And could those be released and cause damage to humans and animals? Thank you.
I have not seen any studies to indicate that, but I will. Viruses and bacteria that we don't even know exist yet. So yeah, I mean, this is why this is exciting, right? Because I have no idea, but give me 4 or 5 years and I'll get back to you.
All right, thank you so much.
Great, thank you. So we have a question that came in through social media about you speaking about these issues to different audiences. And this person saw your video speaking to a younger audience and wanted to know if it's always the same message that you share between students and your fellow scientists, if the message changed and if the one audience is more difficult than the other.
Sure, good questions. So I guess I want to reiterate that was edited by Goldie Blocks, who are awesome. And I did not know that there would be a specific focus on farting. If you guys are confused about what I'm saying, go ahead and watch the video. It's very silly. And I think it is harder for me to talk to those younger audiences. That's not something I would normally be talking about. I'm much more comfortable having theoretical discussions with people with a working background knowledge. It's also very difficult to look a 7-year-old in the face and tell them, well, I just don't know how bad it's going to get. So that's important. It's not my favorite because of that. I think that if I were to do something a little bit funner, which I imagine like studying birds would be quite fun, or, fish would be quite fun, but that is definitely a challenge. And I definitely calibrate my message either based on what I'm doing. I try to only share what's going on at the time. I don't try to share, really old research or relatively old research, and also kind of what they're interested in, right? Like part of the message I was sharing with the Goldilocks video was that I'm very inspired by the climate movement that the kids are putting together. And that is a huge deal to me. And so I wanted to really reiterate that for them.
And we will share that Goldilocks video as well in the follow-up email so everyone can watch it, because it is both silly but also really awesome. Fred, do you want to come back on and ask your follow-up question?
Yes. Do you have any idea what the methane concentration is in the methane emissions? Is it enough, for example, that it can be burned? We know that the methane is, figures range from 50 to 100 times as evil as carbon dioxide. And by converting it to carbon dioxide could be lessen that effect.
So you think about physics, right? So things change states, but they don't go away, right? We're in a closed sphere. So burning methane does change its state. I agree with you. And there are locations that there are methane releases that we know about, right? You've seen the videos where the scientists puncture a hole in the ice and light it on fire, and it's this big flame. So that is something that we are able to identify at the time, especially in situ work. The whole point of the project that NASA and ESA is putting together is that it's very difficult to constrain quantitatively how much methane could be released, how and why. Simply because we are not even 100% sure how much carbon is stored in the permafrost. That's still something that we're doing a great job learning about, but it's something that we can still really wrap our heads around. So that is definitely a goal, but it's not something that has a finite answer right now.
Well, we know that the amount of methane can be measured now by satellite, so it's really quite an accessible piece of information.
So that's actually incorrect. Thank you for your question. The amount of methane is measurable by some satellites in certain times of the year. I actually just was working on a Nature paper about this yesterday. In the winter, it's very difficult to visualize via satellite. In the summer, ice and water have a high reflectivity that makes it difficult to visualize that way. Also, many satellites are not tasked for the Arctic region, so it's kind of something that they are able to do within a certain amount of time. So yeah, we really don't know how much methane is coming out of the Arctic region at one time. It's something that is, like I said, emergent in the research.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask Brian to come on and ask their question.
Thank you, Dr. Herman. Pleasure, Dr. Miner. Thank you for giving your presentation today. I wanted to ask you, you talked a lot about microbes coming out of the permafrost, migrating to mid-latitudes and affecting the populace. But are there microbes, bacteria, viruses that you have concern or other scientists have concern that are active today that would migrate poleward as we have Arctic amplification and alter that biome significantly?
Sure, and let me do clarify a little bit. I'm not saying that it's possible for microbes to emerge from the permafrost, move latitudinally, and infect the populace. That is not what I was trying to convey. I guess it is is possible that things are transported globally and that things are emergent from the permafrost. So that's not a causation. That's not it's not probably even a correlation at this point. But
Okay.
to your excellent point, COVID-19 honestly is something that the Arctic communities are dealing with. So, everything that happens on the Earth stays on the Earth. And when you think about smallpox outbreaks, COVID-19, even something as silly as the flu, different kinds of H1N1 as well, all of that has the ability to transport poleward. As far as amplification, constraining that, or I guess amplifying that, I wouldn't necessarily see the correlation there, but again, more than happy to discuss it. It's possible. I'm not seeing how that would cause that to happen.
If I may, just a quick follow-up. I was thinking about more microbes that are active in warmer latitudes, that as the Arctic warms would be moving up and affecting that biome, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Understood. So that would fall under the Arctic greening idea, that as the terrestrial biome changes in the Arctic, that does include the soil strata, and it does include the microbes there. So that's absolutely something that I would say is probably likely. Everything's kind of moving around a little bit. The rate at which they're moving, how they're moving, and who's moving, we're not 100% sure on. But that is definitely something that is likely, that as greening occurs, that the microbiome of the soil will also change. Yeah, excellent point.
Thank you.
And I would also suggest that you look out for another early 2021 webinar with one of our steering committee members from Uppsala University in Sweden, whose work and lab focuses on this specific issue. So we will have a more in-depth conversation about her research in February. We have another question from Yareth on antibiotic resistance. So they understand that thaw-exposed microbes can become resistant if, for example, migrating birds carry antibiotics to the Arctic. Is this theoretical, or has it been documented?
Yeah, I guess I just want to reiterate really quickly that Dr. Herman is really, really excellent and has an incredible network. So really take this very seriously. The experts that she's bringing on are quite strong in this new year. Okay, so Yareth, so antibiotic resistance, I don't know about the bird transport route. I think that's an interesting idea. I don't see why that isn't possible. But there are microbes that have been already discovered, found, however you want to say it, in the permafrost that are inherently antibiotic resistant to our main swath of antibiotics. So when we're talking about the psyllins, the mycins, all of those guys that they throw at bacteria to see what they can sustain. We have found, and not me, so I guess the scientific community has found antibiotic resistant microbes in the permafrost. That is something I didn't really talk about. That I think scares me more than any of the other things so far. But 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It's Halloween, so.
A lot of scary things, though, as a few folks mentioned in the chat, also a lot of inspiring things and work that can be done together, which leads me to a question from Micah on which research questions do you believe to be the most pertinent for future studies? Okay, cool. Micah, I'm looking at the Arctic right now and the permafrost the way that we looked at the deep ocean 20, 25 years ago. I think that there is endless possibility for discovery, exploration. A lot of exploration has been done. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not inventing the wheel here. But I think there's a lot of interesting, novel things that can come from the permafrost, from the Arctic in general, from the ice. That it's going to be a very exciting time. It's thawing, it's melting. That's reality. So because it is, I'm wondering, what can we get from it? What can we garnish from it? What can we learn? How can we be engaged in the system that we are already changing? So those are really important questions to me. As that all happens,
questions around how this is changing the food system, how this is changing the hydrology of the area, the fresh water system, how it's changing the organisms. One of my pet peeves is people are always saying, well, the planet will survive without us. Okay, but we have co-evolved with a number of animal and plant species that are not going to do so well in the same temperature flux that we're not going to do so well in. So it's not just about, the planet will live without us. It's also about making sure that there's a stable biome for all the different things. So that's kind of the root of where all of my questions come from, is how do we maintain a stable biome?
Great, thank you. We have another question from Chris on one study that he read that found that 90% of the human population lives adjacent or close to a coastline. Has climate change caused the population to move further north with the thawing of permafrost? And if you have any general comments about that human displacement in relation to what you are researching.
Sure. So Chris, feel free to jump in here. I'm not totally sure I understand the nuances of which part of this question you want to talk about. So the permafrost destabilizing makes the ground all bumpy and wet. So you probably don't want to be building houses on it. But as the climate warms, I think it's possible that people are able to move further north, and we're already seeing more tourism in the Arctic than we were able to have before. Climate displacement is something that a number of groups are talking a lot about. So that does seem to be a dynamic that is, again, emergent and probably going to change a lot of people's lives.
Yeah, and if you are interested in displacement and migration, we had a webinar in September that focused specifically on human displacement, migration, and relocation. So I would suggest you look at our great archive of past webinars on issues of migration as well. I'm going to ask Hayden to come on and ask their question.
Hi, Dr. Herman. Hi, Dr. Miner. Thank you for putting the webinar on. I just had a quick question, wanted to go back. You had mentioned earlier ocean permafrost. And I wanted to get a quick clarification. Is there a difference between ocean permafrost and the gas hydrates that you can find?
I am looking right now. I believe that gas hydrates are within permafrost, but this is not my area of study. Do you, Dr. Herman, are you more familiar with this? Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not gonna be able to very precisely answer this, but I believe that hydrates are disparate. I think they're different and more spread out than permafrost. Sorry that I can't answer better.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much.
We have a follow-up question or a general statement about international partnerships. And there's a question on how much partnership potential and realized partnerships are built out between Canada and Alaska, but maybe you can talk generally about the importance of international collaborations in your work and to Arctic science.
Yeah, definitely. No, there's some great Arctic collaboration networks going on, even beyond Dr. Herman's, which is excellent. There's the Arctic Council, and then as part of the Arctic Council, there are a number of groups that are either predominantly led by or exclusively for Indigenous rights and led by Indigenous people throughout the Arctic. Okay, so remember, this is a huge area. It includes Russia, it includes Alaska. So we're talking about a lot of different people from a lot of different cultures. And we've done, I believe, as a global population, quite a good job of getting together and talking about things. I'm going to a conference next week that was supposed to be held in Italy. There was one last week that was supposed to be held in Canada. There's one in 2 months that's supposed to be in Boulder. So we've got a lot of folks getting together to talk about it. And I have found the collaboration to be excellent. Lots of urgency, lots of thorough science and lots of kindness as people try to work together to determine what's next and find a good solution.
Yeah, there is lots of good collaboration going on across the Arctic. And there are lots of good points to start with our steering committee and key collaborators if you're interested in finding particular science networks in the Arctic. We had another question come in on social media about your role as being a woman role model in Arctic science and science more generally. And this person asks, is it difficult to work in a male-dominated field, and how have you become a role model for girls?
Torn about how to answer that. I think that it is difficult to be a scientist, and I don't know if it's difficult because of a certain gender or if it's just a difficult road. I think that there is unfortunately underrepresentation specifically in, this is all of my personal opinion, there's underrepresentation specifically in how awards are distributed. I think the Nobels are an excellent case in point that Nobel Prizes are not awarded to women who are deserving. And I think that's a great loss to the field. That's a sadness for society. And because I think that I grew up during a time where it wasn't super cool to be studious and it wasn't super cool to be a scientist, that's been pretty much remediated by the tech billionaires. It's now pretty cool to be a scientist. But because I have that background, it is important for me to do the outreach to young people in general. And I hope that that can inspire folks to just be aware of the career possibilities that they have, and that they are able to do anything they put their mind to if they're willing to practice.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Lauren to come on and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, sorry I can't do video. For whatever reason, it won't it won't work. My question is, I do tundra rehabilitation for infrastructure projects in Alaska, and I've done a lot of oil and gas rehabilitation, and now I'm doing telecom rehabilitation, and it's a really challenging job to, especially when you lose ground ice. There's not a whole lot you can do to bring it back. But one of the things that I'm finding is that in a lot of infrastructure projects, people will kind of clear the surface organics in preparation for whatever it is that they plan to do, whether it's laying down gravel or digging or whatever it is. And in the hopes that they can then use that soil like topsoil in warmer climates and be able to revegetate with that soil. What I'm finding is that when you push aside the surface organics, and then you lay them back out on a site, they are not good at all for regrowth. And my thought mostly is that it's like a desiccation issue, is that it's so dried out that, and all you end up with is like a carbon scale network in the soil, and that you've lost most of everything. But I didn't know if you knew anything about like stored soil and the microbial and fungal communities, if there's any effect on that in the stored material, because we're not able to re-wet the material effectively. And it's unfortunate, it's a loss. So it's a loss of really fantastic soil, and a loss for not having good soil to put back.
I had a little theory, but then when you said you weren't able to re-wet it, I'm not really sure. So NPK, right? Some agriculture, most important things are nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon. So I would assume that the carbon is probably still there. So maybe you're losing a different compound that's important. I guess I'm wondering about desiccation. Seems perfectly viable. I wonder just about the quality of it once you've got it dried out, and if there are other properties that you're losing. So I think all of your working hypotheses sound strong to me. It would be very interesting to look at that more in depth and find out what's going on. Good question.
All right, thank you.
Great, so we have one final question, and it is on the co-production of knowledge. So this person asks, how do you work with traditional knowledge holders and Indigenous scholars to produce your research, and what is the role of co-production of permafrost degradation studies?
So as far as this work is concerned, it's brand new. You guys are one of the first groups that I'm talking to about it. So definitely not yet, but that is something that is going to be happening. With my glacial pollution research, I did work with a lot of the groups out in Fairbanks area to discuss not only what I was finding, but whether, you know, our methodologies were realistic, what their capacity was for change, what folks were eating. So a lot of co-production of knowledge there. Because that was a longer study than this has been so far, and because I was able to do that a little bit more one-on-one, face-to-face in Fairbanks. Ideally, yes, definitely. I'd like to do more of the outreach to any local community face-to-face than over Zoom. So if we do get an opportunity to go in the next year up to Alaska, that is going to be an absolute part of it. And as far as I mentioned, the Arctic Council, this network, and then the above program, there's a lot of different folks who are involved, and that does include Indigenous folks from a couple of different countries. So not just from Alaska, but from lots of different parts of the polar north.
Great, thank you. So we have just 5 minutes to go. So in just a minute, I'm going to ask Dr. Miner if she has any concluding thoughts, last words for us as we finish out this webinar. But before I do that, I wanted to let everyone know that this again is part of a series of webinars, and we have lots of great ones coming up that you can register for free. Our next one will be November 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and that will be on the design of the built environment for a changing Arctic. And we have 2 great architects that will be presenting their work, Matthew Joel and Lena Cho, and you can again register that for free either on the hyperlink I've shared in the chat or in the follow-up email. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Miner for any final words that she might want to give before closing out this event.
I just want to say thank you everyone for coming and for sticking with it. This is a interesting time that we're all in. So I'm really grateful and excited that we got to spend this afternoon together. So thank you all so much. And thank you for your interesting questions. You all brought up some excellent points, and I really appreciate the chance to discuss and brainstorm with all of you.
Great, thank you so much. Again, a virtual round of applause for an incredible presentation, and I would say an even more incredible question and answer. We covered quite a lot over this past hour and a half. Thank you all for joining us. As a reminder, there will be a recording of this webinar that will be up later today, and we will do our best to share Dr. Miner's citations and any follow-up information in the email that I will send out tomorrow. We hope to see you at our next webinar on November 11th or other webinars coming up in later 2020 or early 2021. Until the next time, I hope you have a great one. Thanks again for joining us.